Can you describe at a high level how your FCPA compliance programs are structured for high risk markets? And Ryan, if you could start us off, that'd be great.
Sure. I think like many companies, we have a kind of a baseline thing that we do in every country. For example, the hotline or other processes that are just standard across the company anywhere you operate. And then when you tee up a question like that, what triggers in my mind is really, do you do anything different in a high risk market for your ethics compliance ENC program? And I would say yes, and I think most people would say yes, or my suggestion would be you either need to be or you need to at least evaluate, whether you should or not. Maybe you arrive at the answer is no, but let me just use an extreme high risk country maybe. And when I say high risk, I think most of us mean high risk in regard to corruption, meaning how prevalent is corruption in the country with the government officials you're going to deal with mainly. But that's not the only thing. It just depends on what your company does, how it operates. But again, in a perfect world, you would do some form of a risk assessment, which is country specific to those operations, in addition to any risk assessment your company may have already conducted as a whole. But maybe to get to some of the nuts and bolts real quick, in my mind, which I think some people may want to hear is, well, what would you do different? Again, in the highest risk type countries, I know we have, and I've had at other companies, we flat out create a job, and it can go by different labels, but essentially a person who's in country as let's say that local ethics and compliance officer. And in the most extreme situations, that's their full-time job. Now, in other situations, it would be a dual-hatted type role, but somebody that, the compliance department can call on to implement further measures, but also it serves as eyes and ears. It serves as somebody that the local, so to speak, can go to, et cetera, where that's not necessary. I'm trying to think beyond, you would just implement further measures in those countries. Now you can beef up due diligence procedures, you can beef up interactions, et cetera, but those type things come to mind, and maybe I can let one of the other panelists add on to anything that they're thinking of.
Very good, and we'll dig a little deeper into things like due diligence and assessing risk a little bit further in the chat. But Mr. Poole, how about you for that high level? How do you structure your compliance programs for the high risk markets?
I mean, I think it's real similar to how Ryan outlined. I mean, we use kind of a compliance champions network. But one of the things I found effective, when you're dealing with a high risk area, is getting really, how well do you know the folks that are working there? And so, one of the things I challenge my team with is having monthly touch points, right? So if it's a high risk location in West Africa or in Asia, how often are you touching base with the local leadership there? Are you attending maybe a staff meeting, and getting to know folks that are critical to minimizing some of that risk, like your procurement folks there, your HR folks, those extra sets of eyes and ears that as they hear things would know to pick up the phone and give you a call. I mean, and we do a lot of things that Ryan referred to as around increased due diligence around suppliers and vendors. I know we're going to speak on that a little bit, but really leveraging the network that you create. In this world today, COVID, you can't necessarily travel to some of these locations, so you really have to rely on the folks that you've built a relationship with over the years, and really pull for information. And then there's always the training and all those things that we do on a daily basis. But I think don't underestimate the value of just reaching out to people on the ground and finding out what's going on locally, and kind of keeping yourself front of mind in terms of if there's an issue, they know who to reach out to.
Very good. Justin, from your perspective, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything much to add to Ryan and Jacques' comments. I mean, apart from just echoing, I think that, that's exactly, what we try to do at McDermott. Just to give you an example of a high risk jurisdiction that we work in is Russia. And both from a corruption perspective and a sanctions perspective, I view it as one of the highest risk jurisdiction in the world. And so our procedures are, as Ryan said, are pretty uniform across the company. No matter where you work in the company, we have a standard set of what it is that you have to do from a compliance perspective. But to me, it's really important that you build in flexibility into your policies and procedures, where you, as the chief compliance officer, or somebody else, an area compliance officer, or someone on the ground, can say, wait a second, something doesn't really look right here. We need to impose additional diligence measures where necessary. And in Russia is a perfect example of that, where we see a lot of in our company, we don't see a lot of corruption, bribery type instances in Russia, but we see fraud, embezzlement type issues. And so what we end up doing is essentially conducting diligence on every single person that we come in contact with in Russia. Every single vendor, every single subcontractor goes through a pretty rigorous diligence process. And we don't do that for every jurisdiction because it's too much to lift. But in Russia, definitely it's a much deeper dive in diligence and in assessing risk for those third parties.
Yeah, kind of spinning off your comment there, Justin, about sometimes things are too much to lift. And one of our prior panelists mentioning, the COVID pandemic, we're all kind of hashing our way through. Are there any tips or strategies you utilize in your respective companies to get more done with less? I mean, given the COVID restrictions on travel and the price of oil being historically lows over the last year, sometimes compliance budgets get a little tighter. How do you deal with those issues?
Well, I think
Jock?
something that, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Justin.
Well, I was just gonna say, one of the things that Jock mentioned earlier was, leveraging the relationships of folks that are on the ground, and that's ever more so important in today's world, particularly with COVID and particularly with budget cuts and that sort of stuff. That you maintain relationships and networks of not only compliance professionals, legal professionals in the high risk areas, but also just the business operations folks. And so one of the things that we do is we have for every operating area that we have a dedicated area compliance officer who is responsible for compliance in their operating area, and they sit as a part of the local executive management team. And so that to me is really, really important in a COVID world where you have somebody who has the ear of the local management team and can see what's going on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And so that's one of the tips that I would say in how to leverage your network in times of budget restraints and times of COVID.
Thank you. Jock, how about your company?
I think I echo again a lot of things that Justin's doing. We have a similar program. I think one of the things that we found effective is targeting certain groups like finance. So we had kind of several internal fraud related issues within the company, and so what we do is we kind of sanitize those investigations, and then we sit down with a broader finance team and say, here's some of the things that you should be on the lookout for. Here's some of the things that you should be thinking about. Here's how this particular situation unfolded. And I think again, it just echoes what Ryan and Justin are saying is as compliance officers and compliance teams, we're very small, and so we really have got to leverage the networks that we have out there. Kind of know who your friends are, and a lot of times our friends are going to be that finance team that's on the front lines of approving information, your HR teams, your procurement teams. Another valuable person that you really should be teaming with is internal audit, and working with them kind of hand in hand in understanding where they're going. Can you give them a few procedures to perform on your behalf because you're limited by people? So I think again, it's just being creative of who you can leverage within your organization to support you. And I think that especially in this world is probably the best thing that we can do from being restricted from doing some of the things that we get to do in the past around travel and doing some of those live trainings.
And Ryan, have you dealt with some of those constraints?
Well, let me comment, Jeff. I was going to say to do more with less on your question on that part of it. I mean, I think most would agree there's no substitute in visiting these high-risk countries and some of these places we're talking about. There's just no substitute for it. But one thing I have found is to really have calls more around the clock than I did ever before, and most compliance people are available. 24/7 kind of countries, really there's some their meetings kind of thing. And that's been very beneficial to do it that way.
Very good. We want to kind of segue to our next talking point. My experience in the FCPA space as both a prosecutor that helped out on some of those investigations and been on the defense side handling some investigations for companies and individuals over the last 10 years, about 3/4 of every FCPA problem any company faces, there's usually at least one third party involved in that. It was the kind of the source of the problem. So I want to talk a little bit about third parties. And first question is, how do you each assess whether a third party is even necessary? And then once you get that hurdle jumped, what risk evaluation tools do you use to vet them? How about you, Justin, on that?
Yeah, so on your first part of your question of how do you assess whether or not a third party is even necessary, it's a really difficult one. In terms of your highest risk third parties, so like the folks that you have out there engaging government officials on your company's behalf, so like your sales agents, your sales reps, your sponsors, those type of folks, what we evaluate is whether or not we have anybody in-house that can serve as that role, that can serve in that role. And if the answer is unequivocally, then that's kind of the first hurdle. Then if we need someone who is a local representative, either by law or by necessity out of just not having anybody who can fill that role, then that's the clearance of the first hurdle. And it's sometimes difficult because usually the folks who are asking to establish a new business relationship with those type of third parties are folks in our sales teams who are responsible for winning work in high risk markets, and so they come at it from a perspective of no, there's never who is capable of performing that role in-house. It's a bit difficult. You got to peel the layers of the onion back a little bit. But once you do that, our diligence system that we use has historically been a system called Compliance Desktop through Red Flag. And we've just recently started a transition over to SecureMate with Steel. And so we're going to see how that works. But once you get into the system, it looks pretty standard as far as what other companies are doing with your questionnaires and that sort of diligence. We always, on those type of high risk third parties, always engage a background investigation type service that gives us reputational data points, that gives us anything from a corruption risk perspective with respect to each individual third party. And so we have that, and then we also build in a face-to-face interview type process for every single one of those high risk agents.
Very good. Ryan, how about Bechtel? How do you guys assess your third party necessity?
Yeah, and again, what Justin described sounds very familiar, all in a good way. But on the front end, and not necessarily where I'm at now, but drawing on that and drawing on prior stuff in my career, I've seen is, the business drives the kinds of vendors they would need in the broadest sense of that word, the goods and services they need. But the compliance folks usually somehow interject themselves hopefully into that process, layering on to that process of, hey, who's bringing in these third parties to the company? Who does that already? I just want to run a filter that says, hey, do they interact with government officials essentially? Do they interact with other people? If they don't interact with anybody, I usually say, look, they're low risk. But what I would try to do is have them evaluate the government official interaction, have them do that. But what I've seen is if there's a bunch of no answers in the way that make them low risk, then maybe you can get a more senior person and authority to sign off on that evaluation of the vendor services. At one company, it took a VP signature. If somebody was saying, no, they're not an agent, they won't do this, they won't do that, a VP would have to sign off to kind of reinforce that answer. And then the ones that were flagged as some kind of interaction with outside parties, they were sent to compliance basically to further evaluate. And I found that, it's not foolproof, but it's probably an extra measure that a lot of companies don't have. And whether you need that on a country specific level or company wide or something is, you can play around with that factor. But I've seen that be very effective to get them into the right channel to start with.
So, Jock, how does your company approach the assessment of whether a third party is necessary?
Yeah, it's very similar to what Justin and Ryan touched on. The only thing I could add is I think it was 2 years ago we implemented a business intermediary policy. And if you're talking high risk, third party agents, if we're going down, a joint venture path, and we put pretty tight controls around that process in which, obviously we do our due diligence. The business unit that wants to sponsor it has to provide a business case to our CEO and general counsel, and they ultimately will approve. We've had over the years, a fair amount of pressure from our board to reduce the number of agents that we have. And so that's been actually a big focus on us. And I know we'll touch a little bit more about what we do with some of these high risk, third parties. But yeah, very similar to Justin and Ryan, there's a lot of, transparency, visibility, and really pushing back on the business to say, hey, why do you need this individual or this partner? Can we do this, in a different way without having to assume some of the risk that goes with it? So.
I'm assuming all of your organizations, as part of your third party due diligence processes, have some type of requirement that they have a written contract with audit and termination rights and things of that nature. How often do you, for example, conduct an audit in exercising those rights, Justin?
So yes, to your question, yes, our going down to our vendor level, so just supply contracts, we have audit clauses in our contracts, and that's not only for compliance reasons, but also just kind of a flow through from customer contracts as well. But so to your second question, how often do we exercise? What I do is I maintain a relationship with the head of our internal audit, and I have input on an annual basis in building out the audit plan for the year. And so he and I will sit together and kind of game plan who is going to be audited. And usually we're picking somebody who is, doesn't have to be one person. It could be multiple third parties. But what I'm usually doing is picking someone who, is in a high risk jurisdiction or we have had issues with in the past. And thankfully that doesn't happen very often. But if doesn't fit either of those two triggers, we just pick somebody and do it randomly and figure out one person or one couple of entities that we're going to look at on an annual basis. And so then internal audit runs with that and then feeds back the results to me and the area compliance teams.
Very good. Jock, what are your thoughts on kind of exercising those rights that you have in your contracts? I know from the government's perspective, having a right that you don't exercise is often a red flag in and of itself. So I think you have to keep that in mind in your compliance programs. If you're going to ask for something, you need to make yourself avail yourself of its use and its privileges. So how does Oceaneering approach that?
You know, I feel like I'm in good company today, Jeff, because I echo the same comments that Justin just put forward. You know, we team with our internal audit group to go out and, you know, target, you know, 2 or 3 companies annually. You know, are they in a high risk jurisdiction? You know, are they kind of key suppliers? We also work, you know, with our quality folks and our procurement folks to sometimes kick the tires as they're going out and doing some of their assessments. We also do desktop procedures. So we talked about some of these high risk third party intermediaries. You know, we may not be able to go out and do physical audits annually, but we will do a desktop procedure to make sure that we're tying out, you know, invoices to contracts and making sure that those issues are correct. And we, you know, just recently we've had to exercise our right to audit and did use that and push back on a supplier that was being a bit difficult. And so absolutely, I think and I think to your point, Jeff, to create that, you know, God forbid you create that record that you're out there being proactive and you're addressing, you're really looking at your supplier base. And, you know, I'm getting more involved in some of the ESG fronts, and that's going to be even more critical. You know, I know for our customers, they want to know, hey, what are you doing around, you know, modern slavery or human rights issues? So all those things, you know, we really need to leverage all of our teams to support those efforts.
Jeff, let me add, very much the same. What they said sounds all familiar, but 2 things that they both mentioned was, I've noticed that what the customer wants and the flow downs from the customer contract requirements is more and more an issue. And it's not just say anti-corruption type stuff, which was traditional. They want to know on modern slavery or these other issues. So a factor more than ever is what are the customer expectations, right? Well, they're going to be auditing us coming around. So we need to, the best answer would say, oh, of course we exercise the audit rights and, you know, here's the results kind of thing, versus, hey, we chose not to, which is a fine decision maybe, but you're going to have to explain it, where maybe you have another customer that's not even going to ask in the first place. And so you factor that into, you know, ultimately your audit plan. And then maybe my last comment on that is just, I think all of us are in agreement, but when you engage the internal audit or the business folks, just one thing that, again, the compliance people do that they just haven't heard before is you try to get them away from focusing on the spend amount, which is one of their traditional ways, which, you know, that does not equate to exposure in our world, so to speak. And most of them get it, but sometimes that can be a change, a really big change. But it's important. But I you know, I've had that conversation many times, and I expect to have it many times in the future. But getting away from spend, I think, is part of our job to remind everybody about that exposure, regardless of spend.
Yeah, that's a great point.
In your respective organizations, are third parties, once they've been identified and determined that they're a necessary business operational need and they've been assessed, are they subject to the same training and compliance certifications as your employees?
I'll start with that, Jeff. Short answer is no, but what are they subject to? We expect them to have those concepts, maybe a certification process, depending on who they are, in some kind of training. So the starting point would be, what do you do? Show us your training program. And if you don't have one, let's get you some training, whether I do it personally, you take our online training, a combination of the both, or we get you to go through Trace or some other third party or whatever. But if we think you need training, let's get it to you. Now, many times the more sophisticated, you know, parties will have some form of training themselves. And as long as they're covering on those concepts, that's great. But I mean, I've never seen where they go exactly this, you know, where they follow exactly the same training that you're doing necessarily. Now I've gone out to third parties and held kind of FCPA training for their employees, and it felt a whole lot like the same thing I did for my company. But those kind of custom fit ones. So there's many ways to do it, but we just start at the high level of, well, let's make sure they have some kind of training, and there's about a half a dozen different ways to make sure that happens.
Ryan, have you ever had a situation where you've proposed the need to conduct some type of training for a third party and he or she pushed back in some way that made you think they didn't want to even hear that? How did you address that, if it's ever happened? And I'll throw that out to the whole panel.
Yes, would be the answer. Well, and I've heard that internally. Why do you want to bother these people with that stuff? To get over that hurdle. Then with the third party themselves, ultimately where it comes down to, I think, Jeff, is the training will happen. Maybe it's of who has to be in the room. You know, we flagged 42 employees and they agreed to 20 employees or something. But that's hopefully where you're haggling over, and not the concept of having some training in the first place. But like everything, it's a negotiation. And now that said, some suppliers are open arms about it. I have had ones that said, hey, if you can get on a plane and come over here and, you know, you, Ryan, or somebody else do it, because we don't know what we need to know for this, that would be great. And so many may fall in that category, but the ones that there's a fight about, it more or less plays out like I described.
Jock or Justin, ever receive any pushback from a third party on training or compliance certifications?
I mean, the one I just touched on about where we had to leverage our audit rights. I mean, they did push back, and I think it was, you know, they didn't have some of the policies that we would have expected. And we hadn't really run into that situation where we had to kind of take a firm stance and say, listen, this is kind of, you know, this is going to be incumbent upon you continuing as a supplier that you're going to take these actions on. And so, you know, like Ryan said, you got to negotiate a little bit, but I think if you put a good foot forward and you're transparent and you show a genuine willingness to kind of work with them and help them out, I think most companies will be responsive. And if they're not responsive, then I think you know your answer, you know, right then and there, that they're probably not a supplier you want to be doing business with.
Understood. Now, how would you kind of spinning off one of Ryan's points, not the external pushback, if you receive internal pushback, probably from the business folks? You know, Justin, how would you deal with that, and how would you resolve it if you couldn't come to an agreement with the business person?
Yeah, that's much more likely in my world to occur than have the third party pushback on whether it's annual certification process or whether it's training. And the way we deal with that is, you know, I try to communicate with those folks to spread the gospel. You know, explain why we're doing these things and why they're important. And that usually gets us to where we need to be. I haven't had to really escalate those things, but we have an escalation policy in our program where, you know, if we're seeing something that needs to be actioned or taken care of, and we're not getting buy-in from the local management or the business that is responsible for relationship with a particular third party, we escalate that to more senior level management. We haven't had to do that, at least in the corruption space. Just one. Sorry, Jeff. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Justin.
One thing I was just gonna also add is what Jock and Ryan were talking about. One of the things that we employ is a concept of each of the high risk third parties that I talked about previously. So your sales agents, your sponsors, those type folks we identify a compliance business sponsor who sits in the business and who is responsible for all things compliance with that third party. And so usually that is a member of the local management team who, you know, utilizes the services of that particular third party. And one of the things that we've implemented pretty recently here is to require a periodic meeting with those people where compliance is discussed. In terms of, just talking about FCPA or talking about UK Bribery Act and what it means, and not necessarily anything that is going on in the particular relationship, but more educational, where our business sponsor is the person responsible for making sure that their agent understands compliance, understands what we want, understands what the corruption risks are in that particular engagement, and then that gets fed back to us. And so we kind of have a visibility on what is actually going on the ground in these relationships.
Yeah, it's been in my experience in private practice. A lot of times the pushback on compliance does come from the internal, from my perspective, sometimes from the client. I had represented a company a few years ago that had a FCPA investigation that centered largely around their third party in the Middle East country where they derive probably 60% of their company's income. And he was referred to me by the CEO as, this guy's a tiger. He can do things that no one else can do in that country. And we have to treat him in a way that respects and understands that. And I had a good relationship with the CEO, and I was like, I understand that. And that's when you segue into that discussion about the U.S. sentencing guidelines and how the Bureau of Prison works. And that usually kind of softens that stance. And we were under an active investigation. And fortunately, we ended up kind of working through it and getting a declination at the end of the day. But, sometimes the pushback is, it's revenue driven. When that third party is really, really good at what they do, and doesn't mean that they're doing something corrupt. It causes suspicions. And in my experience, prosecutors are a cynical lot. And if they see smoke, they're going to think there's fire there. I want to transition.
Jeff, let me make a comment real quick on that. When you ask what works internally, I've had conversations pretty much that would say, once you demonstrate why it would be valuable for the company to have these things from the third party, which is kind of the conversation you were just saying, you pretty much say, hey, look, this is an easy one. Okay. I'm not asking you to go through training internal person or you to write up a business justification on one of these commercial type agents like Jock mentioned, or I think Justin too, et cetera. This is all on the third party. I'll go over there and do the training, or somebody like me, and they need to fill out a piece of paper that says they didn't bribe anybody on our behalf. I mean, this is an easy win for us. So let it happen. You're standing in the way of it, but we'll get this done, as opposed to what they would see as much more burdensome things that compliance may want to get done within the company from time to time. This is a simple one. And I try to take that approach because frankly, I think it's true.
Very good. Now, if you've onboarded a third party, he or she's working for your company, and then some red flags start to emerge about their conduct, what are your steps to address those red flags so you can get comfortable with him if you can? Jock, how about you on that one?
Well, I think we implemented a tool that gives us kind of that continuous monitoring of suppliers, so that gives us a little bit of comfort. But I think just like in any investigation, if there are certain red flags that are coming up with respect to a supplier, we don't shy away from it. We certainly will kind of follow our normal process. We'll engage. Depending on the nature of it, we'll initiate an investigation. If it's something that we think we can use internal audit to do some forensic work, we'll do that. We like to do a lot of stuff kind of in the background first and kind of understand what the issues are. And then I think once we're in a position to kind of confront, the supplier or the individual, then we'll move in that direction. But I think we treat it like we would any kind of, hotline request or report, or, whether it's an internal or external issue. We kind of have a set investigation process that we would follow, like we would in any other case. So suppliers would fall under that, and we would address that. And obviously I think we talked about your contract terms, the right to audit, reviewing that in advance, understanding what kind of the key deliverables were for that supplier, and working with the business to understand, how important they are to the business. So all the things have to be taken into consideration. But at the end of the day, if they're doing something that is going to potentially impact you or your reputation, you need to address it.
Justin, how about you? I mean, when you get a red flag, how do you get yourself comfortable with it?
So very similar to what Jock was saying. I mean, if we have a supplier who, or an agent or subcontractor, whoever, if we have a credible allegation of wrongdoing, what we would typically do is immediately put that person on hold. And so no payments would be made to that person without my authorization. And then we would, very much like Jock, conduct an investigation. And depending upon, how credible the allegations are, what the allegations are, we would either conduct that internally, remotely here in Houston, or on the ground. We're all very flexible on that. And then whether or not we engage external counsel is another question. And typically we would engage external counsel if we see there is any potential legal liability for the company at the end of the tunnel. And in those cases where we have to make absolutely certain where we protect privilege, we would engage external counsel. But that's really, we get a lot of complaints about a lot of vendors, and they all raise red flags, and so that's how we get comfortable with the red flag is just looking under the hood a little bit and taking it from there as far as an investigation is concerned. And sometimes we don't get comfortable with the red flag and we terminate those relationships.
Yeah, very good. I think your point about withholding payments is, I've had the occasion in two different internal investigations where we thought we had some issues with the third party, where my advice to the client was, we cannot pay them. One was a purely internal investigation. The second one was actually a DOJ fraud section FCPA investigation where the client owed the agent an $8 million bonus payment. And I'm like, there's just no way we can ever explain to DOJ while we're in the middle of an investigation, we cut an $8 million check to this guy. So he had to wait about 3 years to get paid, but we got our declination. And then at the end of the day, they paid him. So it does work out.
Well, that's the way, you maintain leverage over your third parties as well. It's withholding payment and exercising those contractual rights. You make the big payment, they go under the wind. And so withholding that payment gets at some level of cooperation in my experience.
Yeah, he was very cooperative when we had his $8 million. We never had
gets their attention pretty quick when you hold up payment.
Yeah, it did. Justin, you made the point about deciding when to engage outside counsel or begin an internal investigation. Can you just kind of describe the process? And I'll throw this out to everyone, kind of what you do when you make that decision to move forward with an internal investigation. How do you kind of structure that?
So I think we, whether or not to move forward with an internal investigation is the easy step. We probably are on the conservative side where we'll launch an internal investigation, pretty much for every single hotline report we get or every single allegation that we get in the door, we launch some sort of an internal investigation. When we get further on down the road on, corruption, embezzlement, fraud, sanctions issues, those investigations, then we will make a decision as to whether or not to hire external counsel for those. And typically, I have a team that's thankfully really good at internal investigations and folks that have, law enforcement investigation experience. And so we have good resources in-house to conduct, the vast majority of our internal investigations. But when we're working in jurisdictions that don't recognize, in-house legal privilege, we would, and we view that there is a risk of legal liability for the company, we would engage external counsel in those jurisdictions. It hasn't happened at McDermott, but in predecessor companies, definitely, where we're working in jurisdictions in Latin America that don't recognize in-house legal privilege, we definitely engage external counsel. But it's not usually, the decision is not usually based on resourcing. We don't look outside because there's not anybody inside who doesn't have the experience to do it. It's usually just that legal liability and privilege analysis on whether or not to engage external counsel.
Jock, what about you? What do you kind of look for to decide whether you need to initiate an investigation?
I really can't add much more to what Justin. I think we kind of follow the normal or that very similar process. I think every investigation has its own little nuance to it, but obviously if it involves certain types of, fraud or something that may have an external impact on the company, we would absolutely go to external counsel for it. So, but yeah, we really kind of follow what Justin outlined. I can't really add a whole lot more to that.
What factors do you look at when you're considering how to scope the investigation? Obviously, investigations come in different sizes. Obviously, if you're at the sharp end of a government investigation, it might be a much deeper and wider dive. But Ryan, how do you kind of, at the beginning stages of an issue, how do you determine how many people you need to put on the investigation, who it is, whether it needs to be outside counsel, things of that nature?
Well, with taking a business approach, you would say, how narrow can it be? How narrow can this be without turning a blind eye to things? And so part of that is, well, what do we want to get answers to, if at all possible? Or, maybe what are we absolutely going to ask questions about in the hopes that we get answers? And so that's kind of the substance that you're looking into. And then that, to me, that would lead how you need to staff it, how you need to carry it out, et cetera. And for the outside counsel angle, as was said, I think, Jeff, I think you know this too, but being outside counsel, to me, you always start with, why can't we do it internally? For cost reasons, if nothing else, why can't this company do it? Particularly if it's staffed up with law enforcement lawyers that can put privilege on it in certain jurisdictions. And it usually comes down to a privilege issue that we can't get established by internal folks, and or what we think may be a true legal violation, which may take some time to get to that point. And even then, a legal violation of a certain sort, because certain legal violations, you may go, we can handle that, whether we have a reporting obligation to the government or not, whether, we'll process that, or, hey, this is going to be a big deal. The last thing I'd add that maybe is a slightly different angle is, I have seen, if there's some expectations from on high, meaning the board most likely, and probably because it's of such a serious nature, but you may have already asked for outside counsel by then anyway, or it involves a senior executive where you look at it and go, it wouldn't normally, for any other reason, we don't need outside counsel. Like, yeah, but look, it's so-and-so, and the board would prefer it done that way. And the audit committee even mentioned to me, hey, you worked with Bracewell that time. They do a great job. You're like, hey, I'm not going to fight that. That guy wants to hire the firm. He's in charge of the purse strings. Fine with me. And so that's the one other angle that can come into play from time to time.
Very good. Well, you guys have been very, very insightful, and I want to turn to Casey. I think we may have some audience questions.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions that came in. The first one is, due to the high penalties that can be imposed to companies, are there certain countries you have decided not to participate in their market? And if so, which are they? And that's to anybody.
I would say, I know Justin, I think you spoke about Russia. It's one of the areas that we typically try to avoid working in. And then obviously there's some places in West Africa. I mean, we are in Angola, we are in Nigeria, but there's certain places that we would, try to avoid if at all possible. But Russia kind of comes to mind on areas where we provide quite a bit of pushback to the business when they have an opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I wish Russia was on my list of countries we didn't engage in, because it is a rat's nest of issues in dealing in Russia. But I would say for McDermott, everything is very fact specific, engagement specific. We don't do a lot of, we don't do product supply. We have major projects, and so we're pretty much in all the jurisdictions that we work in anyway, and we have relationships built up where we work, and so we don't really have the new country analysis very often. But I would say that there's not any jurisdiction where we've just said blanket, we're not going there. Russia's pretty close, but it's that's the only one that I really think is close.
Jeff, let me say the short answer to that question is no. There's not anywhere we won't consider for business reasons. And I say that collectively, I don't want to speak for my company necessarily. In my experience, the only time I've seen companies that can, that are not so customer driven, that have the luxury of taking that stance, is an oil company. Beyond that, everything flows down from there, and you got to consider it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Case, do we have time for a question?
Yeah, we have about a minute or two left. So maybe just real quick, if anyone wants to take this last question, and that is, how do you train third parties in different countries, languages, and culture? It's a follow-up from the previous question. So again, how do you train third parties in different countries, languages, and culture? Is it effective, or is it just a mitigator for future issues? So who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll take it real quick and then let Jock or Justin go. Look, short answer is in their native language if you can do it. If you can't, you can source it from the outside. It's possible. But I think the question had something about beyond language, maybe culture. That's a whole nother can of worms. Essentially, you just try to make clear what your company's culture is and what the expectations are, and have that discussion and you know, try to ensure that. But some of these countries' cultures may be very different than your own company, but you at least need to explain your company's expectations.
And I'll just add real quick, you know, one of the things I do, all the things that Justin and Ryan do in terms of training, but you know, when you're out traveling, and at some point hopefully in the next year or so, we'll all be traveling again. But when you get out to those locations, meet with those high risk third parties and have a conversation, sit down, gives you an opportunity to kind of size them up a bit. And it puts a name to a face. I think you can't underestimate the importance of just getting out there and having a conversation. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. Nothing to add for me.
And I would just add it, you're doing those things because, yes, they are effective, not just a compliance stopgap. At least you hope they're effective. Or at least that will be the answer if DOJ asks.
That's right.
Well, let's hope that's not.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is great. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground here. I really appreciate you being a part of this event. Thank you.